Okay. Well, it's absolutely, I can't tell you what a pleasure it is because we're all in isolation at the moment. So I'm coming to you from a very rainy shed, and hope you can hear me loud and clear, which probably after 5 weeks in isolation with my family, they're very grateful that I am in the shed. So, I'm currently with Tom and Emily, who have written two hugely, they're not only informative, which, you know, we all hope that we do that, but they're really enjoyable looks at completely different parts of what I see as part of, you know, Georgian history. So Tom's book, City of Beasts, How Animals Shape Georgian London, is just, for me, was added so much depth and warmth and sight and smell and all of these kind of sounds that I'd always known existed in, because obviously Georgian London belongs to me.
You're allowed to say that.
I know. So just depth to my city, and I love the characters that fall in and out of Georgian London the whole time, and Byron is clearly a huge part of that, and his legacy to us as modern people, which I think is something that Emily will definitely bring in. I think he's one of the first people that possibly speaks to, and Emily absolutely must come back to me on this, speaks to us about our modern identity and how we identify with ourselves. So I wrote Georgian London in 2013. Tom has City of Beasts. Emily has The Fall of the House of Byron, which was out on the 16th of April. All are available. And so here we go. I'm going to hand over to ask. First, I'm going to ask, because I know why Tom wrote his book, and that's something that I feel very much, because I wrote a book called Into the Streets. But I'm going to ask Emily what drew her to the House of Byron, first of all.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so it was many things, and I will confess that the sort of spark of the idea happened at about midnight one night, and I'd had some wine and I found a portrait that I totally fell in love with, and I just had to find out more about this woman. But for me, I think in my sort of research background, there were so many elements of what became this story that they occurred to me individually, and then I just sort of united them in what became this basically family saga. So there was this portrait of Isabella Byron that I found and I was in love with. Also, my sort of research background, which over the last few years has just been the history of love and sex and scandal and all this sort of romping kind of social history, which obviously, as you say, the poet Lord Byron, that name just features constantly in this sort of 18th, 19th century sexual adventuring. So he was sort of always lurking a little bit in the back of my mind as well. But also my background professionally, some of that has been professional genealogy. So I can't resist just digging into sort of the parish records and, you know, sources of these people who people don't care about or who haven't been uncovered before. And I can't resist sometimes just nitpicking away at that sort of thing. So all these three things just combined into me wanting to write eventually this saga, which I hope is sort of, the aim was as an immersive sort of depiction of what it was like to live through that time through the eyes of this one family.
Which I think is something that you've really brought out in the book, because for many people, I think, and definitely I would say that I came to this not through your book, but in studies before. People think that Byron kind of leapt into the world fully formed and went on to become this poet and revolutionary, but of course he had the family background of complete crackpots behind him, but marvellous crackpots, and they had a great connection to the land and a great connection to what they felt was their heritage, and also to the time that they were living in, even though then Byron went on to become incredibly modern, which for me, he kind of hit the peak of when people were developing their new romantic modern identity. Would you say that was something that you agree with or not?
I would say so. I think in a way he was a bit of an outlier in what we now call sort of the movement of romanticism. I think a lot of the time he just did what he wanted. Like if he was just pursuing his pleasure, you know, he wasn't necessarily out to sort of forge a new life or a movement or anything, but he has obviously he's such a gripping character and such a forceful character as well, that now it's easy for us to sort of pick him out as the figurehead of one of the figureheads of this quite radical time. So yeah, I'd agree, definitely.
Cool. Well, I'm going to go to Tom now and say, so Tom, I know because I read your book and obviously, and I know that one of the things that really touched me, and I think it would touch lots of people, is and something we're certainly going back to now, is listening to tiny elements of daily life, like birdsong. And I'm still going to say I'm tone deaf, so I can't tell a robin from a chaffinch or whatever. But one really lovely moment was when you decided to really stick with the book, was hearing the horses walk along outside that Islington house that you were in. Was that Islington window? Yeah. And you thought, yeah, this is what people would have heard, and that struck such a chord with me. And I think that is a thing that goes all the way through the 18th and 19th century in cities that we've definitely lost now. So anyway, I'm just going to give the floor to you.
Well, it was slightly further west. It was a Victorian flat in Kentish Town, and I'd been there for a few years, and I'd never seen horses on the street before, and it was one of the last kind of exercises that the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery horses were making back to barracks before they moved to Woolwich. I think it was particularly unusual. None of the horses were wearing saddles, and the steam was rising off their backs as they were walking into the cold morning air and stuff. So it didn't feel like a 21st century experience, so that sort of got me thinking, really. But going right the way back to undergraduate days, my undergraduate dissertation was about sort of everyday life in 18th century Durham, and people arriving from the hunt with muddy boots and trying to get into the assembly, and fights, and kind of tradespeople, and all the kind of really nitty gritty of daily life. There's always been much more interesting to me than kings and queens, and the book was recently described in a review as a working class history of animals, which although I do talk about the middling sorts and the elites in there, I suppose what really gets me going is those interactions between the forgotten human characters, the draymen and the farriers, and the carmen and the Smithfield drovers, which have been completely forgotten, and really are the only way that horses weave their way into this history is if they're being bred for, raced by, or ridden by elite people. So I suppose that's really what excited me, and I'm sure that's got something to do with the fact that my father was a pig farmer while I was growing up, and although I wouldn't claim to be bringing any pig farmer's son experience to the book in that sense, I did pick up the kind of stresses and strains of the job and the difficulties, and that's what I was really trying to tease out in the book, which was no easy task, but hopefully I managed.
Well, you certainly did, and I think one of the things that because my mind always goes from A to Z, was that I missed there was, I think that what both your books bring out is, and what fascinates me in particular, is the completely ordinary life, which, and particularly with animals, ordinary animals. Everyone of every social station had animals, or were surrounded by animals of some kind. And it doesn't matter whether you're Byron or a housemaid, there'll be a cat or a dog or a pig, and then there'll be loads of sheep going down the street. And then also, I think one of the things that when I was doing Georgian London, was all the milk stations that were around in London. And obviously you had cows being led down the Strand to be milked, and also kept in cellars and things like that. on rotation. They didn't just keep them there until they died. Took them out so they could be milked. But also people had sheep and donkeys making little rounds in case your baby was lactose intolerant, and you probably wouldn't have known why that was at the time, but you had to learn because your baby needed to feed and stuff. And those really ordinary livestock interactions were things that really fascinated me and have fascinated me always about the 18th century. But yeah, anyway, that's me rattling on. But I want
one thing I was going to say is that I really enjoyed in Emily's book, there's a sort of moment where there are just these little snapshots of where the coachman is kind of settling down the horses while the main action is going on with the Byrons. And it's amazing how the moment you put in one sentence or half a sentence involving horses, it somehow sucks you into the period in a way that other details don't. And it's something that period dramas actually quite often do very, very well. And I think they're so panicky about choosing the wrong horse to appear that they actually often do a very, very good job. Like in Poldark, for example, you see the sort of Midland black, dray horse sort of appearing or whatever, and they do a really good job. And hats off to Emily. That was those sort of details I thought worked really well and very evocative.
Thank you. I think one of the things I was trying to do, obviously, I was quite limited, I suppose, in a way, in that this is through the eyes of an aristocratic family, and I wanted to be able to, immerse the reader in that world, but I didn't want the rest of the world to be invisible, and I think that so often happens in aristocratic history. So people of people of different classes or racial backgrounds or animals or whatever, I wanted to try and draw them in so they're at least the peripheral characters in the Byrons' lives that they would have been, to try and create the scene and create the sort of vision of the century. So thank you very much, that's kind.
So as either one of you can take this one, I know what has always drawn me back to the 18th century, but I would be very interested to hear from both of you why, because you're coming to it from completely different takes. One is a person, one is animals. What draws you to the 18th century in particular?
You want to go first, Emily?
Okay. Bye. Yeah, I mean, for me, I have always loved it for as long as I can remember, specifically through period dramas, which is probably not a very intellectual answer, but growing up and loving the sort of Austen adaptations and also like Hornblower TV shows and stuff like that. So literally from being 8 or 9, I loved the whole aesthetic of it. And then being older and drawn into actually studying what it was all about, I think for me the century is just it seems to be such a more fast-paced and formative time, but it's also full of really great stuff and really awful stuff, sort of living in a juxtaposition together. So for example, we've got I love the print culture that the 18th century gives us. I think it's such a rich source and it's endlessly fascinating to me. And so that's obviously driving social change and allowing us all this amazing glimpse at life that we might not have had in earlier times. But then also it's the height of the slave trade and we've got all this colonial dreadfulness going on, and I think it's as an era, well, as historians, it's really important to be able to take the good with the bad and to respect both and to be able to use them to sort of examine human lives and human experiences. I just think that this century in particular is such a great example of the great achievements and then also what we can see now as really dark moral problems in human history as well.
I'd agree with all of that. I think for me as well, it's always neatly parked for me, the 18th century, between something really quite familiar and a lot of the things that we're living with now, consumerism, pollution, growth of industry, and a lot of for example, the birth of celebrity and things like that are there and very familiar, and the way that people are writing and speaking. If you're looking at the Old Bailey proceedings, for example, or even in newspapers, quite often the language feels quite familiar. It's quite accessible for people. But at the same time, there are some very peculiar, unfamiliar things there, and the two are intermingled, which I think makes it really intriguing. I mean, I went to university as an undergraduate, you know, with parents who sort of liked 18th century antiques and things, but other than that, didn't really have any particular interest. And I really struggled to find modules that interested me until I did a life in the 18th century Northeast, which didn't sound a very promising module until I got the chance to start reading 18th century diaries. And I don't know, perhaps there are not that many 19-year-old men that get the thrill that I got from reading kind of 18th century women's diaries, but I was reading Judith Milbank's diary, and I think the Milbanks crop up in Lucy's books. I can't quite remember how Judith fits in, but I just found the gossip and the details of every life in that fascinating, and to go to the library and read that and then walk back through Durham's 18th century streets with these evocative names like Flesher Street and things like that, was really enthralling. So, and I never looked back from there. And I think, you know, that sort of everyday life aspects of Georgian London from then on is what hooked me.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only agree with everything you both say. I mean, it's just the first documented period and the first time people really seem to feel like us. If that, I know that there are massive distances. I mean, I was doing some work on a lady who went with her husband to America as a diplomat's wife, and you know, they went out for 2 days canoeing on a river, and then she said, oh, we found this amazing pair of snakes fighting, and they were huge, and she goes into this massive description of these snakes fighting. It must have been some kind of mating dance, and or you know, 2 males fighting, or perhaps a mating dance. And then I was waiting for this kind of sort of natural history, David Attenborough, isn't it marvellous? And she said, obviously he killed them and then we ate them.
Obviously.
It couldn't be more 18th century, could it? You know, short of a bit of grub for tonight, let's just kill them and eat them. And then she comes back to Scotland and makes this incredible American garden. I was thinking, hope you get some snakes. But yeah, it's that kind of immense practicality coupled with the new Enlightenment coming, which happens so uniquely in Britain, and I bang on about that a bit too much maybe, but I have very strong ideas about that. We're getting tons of questions, by the way, guys, so I mean, we're going to carry on talking, but I'll try and introduce some of those in as we go, some of the themes. Hang on, I have our next topic is just coming up. So also a very interesting thing just on that, and I think the two of you will all converge on this. The lives of the middling sort is a really interesting 18th century topic. In that, what are your views? Because I have so many views on it, it becomes a bit muddled. So I'd be very interested to hear what the two of you have to say on. And I know that this is not necessarily connected to your books right now, but that's something that people who write about the 18th century and work in the 18th century are very concerned with. So
you can go first, Tom.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that sort of interesting stage we're at now is that there was lots of talk of emulation a few years ago, and the dominance of aristocratic culture, and of course there were lots of caricatures ridiculing the middling sorts and particularly the mercantile classes for emulating the aristocracy, and that was something that I sort of encountered particularly when I was looking at equestrian culture, which just seems on the face of it would be an obvious thing that people would be just emulating aristocratic riders, and I had great fun reading these merchants' diaries at the National Archives and discovering the independence of their culture and the sort of group identity that these men had revolving around this culture of riding out to scenic places like Tottenham and Romford and things like that. So there's sort of that aspect, and I think as well the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of the middling sorts was really intriguing as well, and how fluid their occupations could be, not always. And so I think their resilience and their creativity and their flexibility in how they made their livelihoods, obviously I'm talking specifically about London, really interests me. But I think there's much more to be done to tease out the kind of depth and complexity of middling sort culture, and we need to sort of break those connections with the elites even more and delve. I mean, I'm far from the first person to do this. Tons of people have been doing it, and we're moving in the right direction on it. But there's lots more to discover, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I mean, I don't feel best placed to answer this, as obviously this book that I've been doing is almost solely about the upper classes. Probably my personal inclination tends to be to do the sort of work that I think both of you two have done more in depth in your books, which is sort of court records and criminality and the lower classes. So for me, the middle classes sort of they're bridging something. I've not quite done too much on that yet. But in terms of sort of for this era, obviously, as Tom says, there's you start to see more surviving diaries for the middling classes, and also the voices just shining through in print culture, which hadn't necessarily existed before. So I think there is a lot out there to be sort of delved into. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I've not done too much of it myself, so I might have to leave that to you two.
No. I think there's tons out there. I think that we have ideas. So I think there's a huge. So a lot of people approached the 18th century with this idea that there was the poor masses, and particularly, well, the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution really hits and you go north. You know, there's this idea of the poor masses where their lives were desperate and everything else. But particularly in London, and obviously my work revolves mainly around London, but being from the north, I'm always kind of looking around for other inputs. There are people who are, to our eyes, and would have been then uneducated Thames pilots. I mean, they earn a fortune now, and the business is largely kept in families. And in the 1820s, and I think as far back as the 1780s, there are diaries of Thames pilots, mainly from families in Poplar, which would make sense. I mean, who were earning gargantuan amounts and had very respectable lives and families, despite the fact that their lives were lived entirely on the river. You know, they were broadly illiterate if you read about them, and anything they leave is mainly to do with what they get paid. But and how important that was to them and things like that. But to the outside world, they would have been very successful people, and certainly of the middling sort, which in the 17th century they would have been able to afford excellent clothes for the family and been turned out very well. Probably would all have gone to church if one of them wasn't on the river. But you know what I mean? That kind of outward respectability that was conferred with financial success becomes a real opportunity for people in the 18th century who were not necessarily educated or godly or all of these different things, but still just carrying on with their own business. And for me, that those people are the middling sort that I would really like to dig into, but of course leave very few real traces on history, even though they're still carrying on now, you know, those family businesses and everything. And I think that's really fascinating. Anyway, sorry, bubbling on.
One of my favourite moments in Emily's book, if this isn't a spoiler moment, I don't think, but is where the wicked lord, where the fifth Lord Byron starts to sort of maliciously take on his neighbours and the mill owners and all of the people that he employed by taking control of the flow of the water. And I won't spoil what happens as a result, but confrontations like that are really fascinating. And in my book, there's a wonderful confrontation between Richard Tattersall, by then had become obviously a very wealthy horse dealer, the most respectable horse dealer in the country, but started out you know, pretty much as a groom, as a stable lad, and he is receiving a letter, I forget from who now, but from a member of the aristocracy, telling him that he sold him a horse that was unsound, and the aristocrat is furious that Tattersall is refusing to pay his money back. And that's an interesting indication of, you know, social mobility and exchanges of power, and how this moves in this period, and seeing the language in their conversation is really interesting. And yeah, I like those moments when someone comes from nothing and all of a sudden is holding some power. And it happened as well because horses conveyed power, because they were powerful objects, powerful beings in their own right physically, but also because they were worth a huge amount of money, and knowledge about them conferred power. You find that lowly coachmen, who would have been often illiterate, suddenly had a lot of power, because the well-being of the horse was in their power. But also, and this ties in with Emily's book, because they were there parked when their lord went to meet their mistress, or with the lady of the house went to see her friends and was gossiping in the carriage. They had a huge amount of knowledge about the household as well as the horses, which made them quite dangerous and bolshy characters who could use that for preferment and to bump their way up the career ladder if they needed to.
Yes, so I want to draw Emily out a bit more about various things, but one of the things that I know that you have in common, and also that that I am hugely interested in, is crime and the language of crime in the 18th century, which I think relates very much to the Byron family, but also to livestock and households in general, something that is emerging in the 18th century. Household crime and sorry for something banging in the background, sorry about that if you can hear it, and how that's expressed in records of criminality.
Yeah, I'll go.
Yeah, go for it. Brilliant.
So there are a few sort of big court cases in relating to the Byron family. Yeah. The first being an adultery case with Jack Byron, who's the father of the poet, later becomes the father of the poet, and his affair with a married woman, which she very quickly gets pregnant. It's quite amazing. But so she gets divorced basically from Lord Carmarthen. Her husband files for divorce. But obviously what that means is that at this time, a hugely expensive deal to get divorced. It requires an act of parliament. So in this court case, the dirty laundry is basically aired for everyone to see. And not only that, in front of the sort of courtroom, but also then it's transcribed and typed up and, you know, published as this amazing book with, you know, fornication in the title, that kind of thing. So in there you get the servant's eye view of all of this crime, and at every point of the affair, how he's sneaking around the house, what he's wearing when he's doing it, how he's swaggering about as if he owns the place, and then scurrying off sort of just an hour before the sort of husband gets home. I just thought that was so amazing. It was one of my favourite sources actually in the whole of the book, and that transcends or crosses all classes, doesn't it, really? So you can get this in this sort of court case, or you get it in your sort of highway robbery, thieving, ne'er-do-well lower classes, which tends to involve a lot more swearing in my experience looking through the Old Bailey as well. But yeah, I just think it's brilliant, and it's obviously something that cuts across aristocracy and yeah, the lower classes as well.
Yeah, so I'll pass that to Tom now about sort of criminality and animals.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a lot of it. Everything from cows being milked by hand in fields, and sort of various types of theft. I mean, it's amazingly brazen what people would achieve, and obviously risky to try. And so people would often, there was joyriding of horses. There was obviously stealing of horses. London was a a real hotbed. Horses would be stolen from Yorkshire and driven at speed all the way down to London to be sold in Smithfield Market for as high a price as possible. But I suppose, so I've got lots in the book about that, lots of pig stealing, which so I mean I wouldn't have learned anything really about pig keeping in London, certainly not domestic pig keeping, without the Old Bailey proceedings. And I was looking for animal theft cases, and in these cases you get amazing acoustic details of, you know, that the owner of the pig was woken up by the squealing of the animal as it was grabbed from the sty. But then you also get these beautiful details of you know, when questioned, how do you know it was your pig, etc. They will describe, well, I know because it had these rusty coloured hairs on its tail. I bred this pig myself. She gave me so many piglets. She never strayed. I could open the gates into the yard and she would always stay there. My wife and children would feed it, and the pig would follow my child around the yard and things like that. Just amazing insights, and just give you this sense of a relationship, which you obviously have to treat quite carefully. As with everything in the Old Bailey and newspaper reports, they gift you all this rich detail, and the temptation to make too much of it, or to not look in under the layers. Credit to the Old Bailey proceedings, who provide tons of information to try and rein us all in on this front. But also, obviously, in terms of crime, the watchdogs chapter in the book was very reliant on the Old Bailey proceedings and newspaper reports, and I thought I could just read you one newspaper report just to give you a flavour of just the incredible. You imagine me sort of, I was looking at these newspaper reports online, and you're going through hundreds and hundreds, your eyes are stinging from it, you're not finding what you want, and then you come across something amazing and bizarre like this. So this is from the Gazetteer in 1767. The burying ground in Oxford Road having been lately robbed of several dead bodies, a watch was placed there, attended by a large mastiff dog. Notwithstanding which, on Sunday night last, some villains found means to steal out another dead body and carried off the very dog. And just the idea of these plucky thieves not only managing to throw a dead body over their shoulder, but also somehow grab hold of this live, huge, snapping mastiff and carry that off as well, I just thought was amazing. And crime just throws up so many incredible sources in Georgian London of all types. So it's a gift. I think, you know, even if people watching, even if this is not their period or they don't do academic research into this, just logging on to London Lives or the Old Bailey proceedings, which you can do for free, and just typing in random keywords or family names or whatever, it's a day, at least a day well spent.
It's lovely as well, because what was super was the Old Bailey records people's own voices, and they don't try and make it into kind of standard language. If someone, you can be halfway through reading a witness statement and you realise that the person involved had a lisp, and the clerk is just writing it down as it was heard, and then that person suddenly, there's a whole different dimension to their character. Or they have, sometimes they can have an accent, or and it's sudden, then the whole thing comes into like glorious technicolor, where you realise so many different things about their testimony, and that's really lovely. It's just Old Bailey Online, the gift that keeps on giving. Right, so we've got a little bit of time before we take questions. So what I'm going to do, we've got questions coming in. I'm going to just go through them and start to frame them for Tom and Emily. And so we're going to have a little reading from Tom and Emily to whet your appetites for their books, which obviously they already have been. But I'm going to ask Emily to go first, and then Tom, and they can introduce themselves and their books. They don't need me to do that for them. And then after that, we're going to come back to you guys, and just feel free to send in your questions now, and we'll pose them to our lovely authors here And that's that. So Emily, away you go.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to read directly from the book and sort of shout it, so I hope you can hear properly. So the bit I'm going to read is an introduction basically to one of the main female characters in the book. She's Sofia Byron. Shortly after the time when this reading is set, she becomes the grandmother of the future poet. So we're in spring 1780 and her Navy husband has just come back from a fairly disastrous voyage. In April, an ailing Sophia and her excitable daughter Augusta left for Bath, leaving her husband John to a peaceful season of gardening and partridge shooting at Purbright. Clattering up to their lodgings at the Belvedere, they gazed out over the magnificent view of the city and wasted no time in finding out who else was in town. The clever hostess Hester Thrale, who showed Sophia so much kindness. 27-year-old Frances Burney, whose novel Evelina was receiving rave reviews. Mrs. Lambert, a chatty army widow, the charming Dean of Ossory and his family, and John's navy friend Lord Mulgrave. The revered actress Sarah Siddons was engaged at the theatre, and the assembly rooms would be fit to bursting. It would be a fine summer. During her husband's recent long absence, Sophia had found consolation in her new set of friends in town. In an attempt to relieve her own sufferings, she dipped her toes into the world of medicine, befriending high society physicians and herself gaining a reputation as someone worth consulting about newfangled treatments. When a Mrs. Gast was advised to try electrical therapy, her brother first begged of Sophia whether in rheumatic cases she thinks people may electrify themselves. On being mentioned to the Kembles, a renowned family of actors, they said every sweet and respectful word in the dictionary. Sophia's ticket into such illustrious company may have been her blossoming friendship with Hester Thrale and the subsequent introduction to the literary salons at Streatham Park in the summer of 1778. Attendees included writers Elizabeth Montagu, Samuel Johnson, who's now most renowned for his dictionary, and Hester's protégée Miss Burney, whose book had been devoured by the Byron household. I pronounce she will be an interesting as well as an accomplished woman, Sophia had declared, and I value myself on having read her early. Though John also enjoyed Evelina, he jokingly questioned the captain's being such a brute. Sophia, who was full of anecdotes and relished an amicable spar, proved a comic addition to their soirees, where she was playfully called Mrs. Baron, always after the French manner. When Hester amused herself by ranking her female associates in her diary, Sophia earned high scores for useful knowledge, 18 out of 20, good humour, 17, person, mien and manner, 16, and conversation powers, 15. That she only achieved 5 out of 20 for ornamental knowledge, singing, dancing, painting and such like, she perhaps owed to those years of pregnancy in Plymouth. Though Sophia initially found Dr. Johnson's heart impregnable, he was swiftly won over with her cheerful chatter. He evidently considered her something of a project. You and Mrs. Montagu must keep Mrs. Byron about you and try to make a wit of her, he encouraged Hester. She will be a little unskilful in her first essays, but you will see how precept and example will bring her forwards. But Sophia preferred to comment on the works of others over creating her own. Her particular enjoyment of innuendo-ridden poem The Geranium reveals a bawdy sense of humour despite her public insistence on propriety. It reads, "Let but the dew of thy soft hand refresh the stem, it straight shall stand. Already see it swells, it grows, its head is redder than the rose," and so on. She lent the verse to Hester, who thought it ingenious, but so obscene I will not pollute my book with it. As well as discussing politics, philosophy and the arts, the Streatham set also amused themselves with parlour games. When assembling his preferred female government, Dr. Johnson appointed Sophia head of the Admiralty. When each person was represented by a meal, she was declared to be provincial toast. When each was assigned an animal, she was the zebra, which was surely more complimentary than the cow bestowed upon poor Mrs. Pepys. Thank you. The end.
Lovely. Do you want to go next, Tom? And then I've got some great questions that came in for Emily during that, but let's go to you and then we can finish it up with some super questions.
Right. Emily's put the bar high. I'll do my best. So I'm going to tell you a bit about cow keeping in Georgian London, but it'll touch on some other aspects that come into the book in this section. So newspaper and Old Bailey trial reports show that Londoners entered cowsheds and yards for many different reasons. Some adults for example, went looking for lost property or climbed drunkenly into haylofts to sleep, while children turned cow yards into hazardous playgrounds. It becomes clear that many Londoners were highly confident around livestock in the 18th century, not least the city's thieves. Despite being far less portable than pigs or poultry and more dangerous to handle, cows remained attractive. In the summer months, thieves painstakingly stole milk from grazing animals by hand. And in more serious cases, cows were driven out of fields and sold to butchers. By 1789, the crime had become so common in Camberwell that the vestry was forced to offer a £10 reward for the conviction of those stealing any horse, bullock, cow or sheep from any field or common. Even more frequently, animals were driven to local pounds in exchange for an illicit reward. In the 1730s, the city's Court of Aldermen ordered that persons who bring in stray cattle shall give their true name and address to the keeper of the Green Yard Pound in Cripplegate, and shall not be rewarded until 48 hours later. Nevertheless, the practice continued into the 19th century, as did bullock hunting, a raucous plebeian sport that involved goading Smithfield droves until enraged animals charged through crowded streets. More respectable forms of interaction with cows stemmed in part from a distrust of milk sellers. Some discerning customers demanded to see their milk being taken from the cow to ensure its authenticity, and this gave rise to new modes of retailing in the second half of the century. Some cows and asses were walked to the front doors of wealthy residences to be milked, but more often cowkeepers invited customers or their servants to visit their premises. Towards the end of the 18th century, dairy shops were constructed in front yards to improve this experience. George Scarfe depicted such an arrangement in 1825 as part of a study of London's evolving shopscape. His drawing of a cowkeeper's shop in Golden Lane on the northern edge of the city not only records its old-fashioned facade, but also the presence of several cows waiting to be milked behind a low partition adjacent to the counter. While much more refined than a cowyard, this layout still enabled customers to see, hear, smell, and even touch the animals supplying their milk. The connection between animals and semi-luxurious goods was both accepted and often actively promoted in this period. While trade cards celebrated the contribution of mill horses in the production of goods, including paint and snuff, barbers, apothecaries, and perfumers also invited customers and their servants to watch bear grease, a pomade for hair and wigs, being cut from recently slaughtered brown bears to authenticate this expensive product. Consumers placed at least some pressure on cowkeepers to keep their animals healthy. If not out of sympathy for the animals and for their own well-being, customers did not want to drink milk from filthy or diseased beasts. We should not therefore assume that criticism of cowkeeping in the 1850s reflected attitudes or actual conditions in the Georgian period. While some cowsheds were almost certainly overcrowded in the 18th century, intensification accelerated after 1800 as cows began to live most of their lives indoors. Scarfe wrote that he selected the Golden Lane site to compare it with the later Westminster Dairy, an elegant milk shop in the Quadrant, Piccadilly. In doing so, the artist drew attention to changes in shop decoration in the Regency period, but even more striking is the disappearance of milk cows from public view. This marked the start of an accelerating separation of milk consumption from production in the Victorian period. Quality control was not the only motivation for respectable Georgian Londoners to get close to milk cows. These animals appealed to polite society's taste for rust in herb and played a significant role in recreational life. Milk became fashionable in this period, partly because of growing artistic and literary interest in the pastoral and a belief that milk offered a tonic for those weary of urban life. At the same time, it was a response to living in an agropolis, a celebration of London's bounty. The capital's parks, pleasure gardens and suburbs were popular venues in this period, offering relief from the hubbub of the city, and interaction with milk cows was an integral part of the experience.
Lovely. I mean, you couldn't imagine two almost different takes on the same thing, but what not the same thing, you know what I mean, on the same period. What was really fascinating there, and one of the things that I really got from Emily's book, I had, despite my brain telling me the more sensible option was that Byron doesn't exist as a thing and of himself, was the lovely London history that his family has, and their connection with the people that are touchstones of London society, and the reputation that they had within that society. But one of the things I got from the very beginning of your book, and touched on throughout, was the connection they had to their estate, to the natural world, to the abbey. And one thing that was really interesting now, and one question that I've had to come in, and I can't see who's asking them because it's too small on my poor beleaguered eyes, whereas if I put my Magoo specs on, you'll all have to suffer that here. But it was, Emily, did you still enjoy the Byrons at the end of the book, or were you glad to be finished with them?
I was very emotional actually. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a weird one because it's basically a prequel, isn't it, to the poet? And so the whole book is leading up to the guy that everybody knows and either loves or hates. So it was very much sort of ending a story, and then readers can gallop off on their own one with the poet if they wish to. So in that way, it didn't quite end. But no, I was sad, especially obviously all the main characters die at the end because it takes them from birth to death. Of course. But, some of the deaths, especially actually the women, Sofia and Isabella, just ruined me for a few days. And especially because Sofia, possibly one of her very last notes she ever wrote as she's dying, is in the University of Manchester, actually, at the Rylands Library. And I was holding that in my hand and just felt like, oh God, this is terrible. She's saying, I feel I'm dying, please never forget me, I beg you, and all this business. And I just, I for all their faults, obviously many of them are totally dreadful, but I was sort of in a way in love with all of them. And I've not moved on yet. It's been nearly a year since I finished writing it, and I've not got a new family to get into, so I guess that speaks for itself, really.
No, it's lovely, and it does take you a long time, I think, to say goodbye, if you ever do, in lots of ways, to say goodbye to and one of the easiest things, I think, is that people think of them as characters, and I wouldn't say caricatures, because they're definitely characters if you're at all involved in the period, but it's almost as if once they become so enormous to take on lives of their own, then in terms of how we see them now, obviously they had lives of their own when they were living them, it's very difficult to let go your idea of who these people were, which I think your book's just lovely in the fact that it gives so much. Obviously it gives backstory, and I hate that word anyway, but it just gives so much depth, textual depth to the period, and also to a man, love him or hate him. Yes, it's very yeah, exactly. So I've got a question for Tom, which I don't know whether I like the question or not, but thank you very much for posing it. Who are the main scapegoat animals of 18th century London?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's a good one, isn't it?
So I think, I will answer the question. I don't want to be a politician on this one. I will answer the question directly. But what tends to happen is actually it's the working class guardians of animals misbehaving that tend to get blamed. So you'll find carters Carmen and Smithfield drovers being described as brutes with two legs, and the insinuation there being that not just in terms of their everyday behaviour, but perhaps the cause of their laziness, their alleged laziness, brutality, is that they've spent too much time in the company of the animals that they look after. So, I mean, there is discussion about the behaviour of some cattle being worse than that of others. And the safety of Londoners very much depends on an exchange of information between country drovers, suburban drovers and city drovers. And that exchange of knowledge often broke down and fatal accidents happened as a result. So drovers were supposed to pass on information that say that the cow that came down, the longhorn that came down from the Midlands had a terrible temperament and would fly into a rage at anything. And that knowledge was supposed to go all the way down into Smithfield. That didn't always happen. When cattle misbehaved, they were described as overdrove. So the blame was always put onto the men who were looking after them. You know, all kinds of animals were poorly treated, and in the heat of the moment, you know, a drover would hit his sheep because they were being skittish and straying all over the street. So people would get frustrated with animal behaviour. So there were plenty of animal scapegoats, horses taking fright at seemingly the most ridiculous things, the sloshing of water, a piece of paper blowing over the paving stones, all kinds of seemingly minor things. But at the end of the day, responsibility came down to the people. And of course, the 18th century, the Enlightenment, is this great period of humanity thinking that it should be able to control nature and control and avoid accidents. So when accidents happen, it's a failing in us, and because it was working class people looking after these animals, a failing in the working classes, who I try to fight their corner in the book, really, because it's a tough job. I wouldn't fancy doing it myself.
No, I think it was really tough. One of the things that, I don't know if this was in your book, Tom, but I came across it when I was doing Georgian London. You had these, particularly in Kentish Town, was one of the places where, because so many animals were being driven to Smithfield, they used to put them in enclosures. You know, people had small enclosures that they used to build up with earth walls and grass and turf and everything else, and then just keep them to rest them for a few days so that they just didn't go berserk because they were being driven into Smithfield. And in a way, it's an amazingly pastoral scene, but at the same time, there's this terrible overladen sense of doom to it all, because you know, we all know how that ends. But really incredibly, and also, so I was just doing some work on Great Newport Street last week, strangely enough, in just north of Covent Garden. I don't know if, well, both of you will be familiar, and loads of people listening probably will. And it was really interesting that there was a slaughterhouse, a shambles, literally next to where all the horses were stabled. So you were commuting in as a middling sort, or, you know, slightly more than that, and stabling your horse the entire day next to an abattoir. And I was really, and this is 1762, and it took me about 3 or 4 hours for my brain to process that concept, because it's now something we would find so utterly unacceptable, that was absolutely part of just, you know, here's my horse, you take it and look after it the whole day, and I'll see you when I'm finished. And you would have been hearing these noises at the same time, and that would have been part of your daily auditory experience. Anyway, that is something, if anyone, we're still getting a few questions coming in, so if anyone wants to pose another question on that. But one thing, and again, for Emily, this is a bit of an unfair question, but it's come in twice, well, it's come in twice. So clearly everyone knows that we have dogs and love dogs, also, you know, horses, everything else, completely devoted to the animals. To what extent were the relationships functional or affectionate with animals? So very famously, Byron, and I know that Byron is not necessarily the focus here, but Byron had Bosun, the dog who died of rabies, and that's a very touching, you know, moment in Byron's life. But for Tom, these animals, so you had spit dogs who would have been inside the house, and also you were talking about the mill ponies and donkeys who would have worked a lot, just being continuously in the background. How much crossover do we have to where these animals are either in use for hunting or for work, and also absolute domestic companions?
Yeah, I mean, it's it gets complicated in some ways the animals are really commodified, as you would expect, but sometimes running parallel to that, for example, with domestic pig keeping in particular, it's more muddled, as I described earlier, from those court cases. The owners' descriptions of their animals, they're certainly not pets, but there is a sort of mutual dependence-based affection that seems to grow up. Obviously get very interesting with horses. Mill horses are, usually blind animals at the end of their lives that are worked to death. So
like pit ponies, essentially, aren't they? I think, yeah.
So I wouldn't claim much affection there, but with dray horses, there was huge affection, huge pride, not just from the owners, but across London. Visitors from across Britain and Europe were astounded by the strength and intelligence of these animals. And then,
look, sorry to interrupt you, but I think something that people might actually like to hear, and maybe you wouldn't put in necessarily, is that a lot of the dray horses were so deeply accustomed to their given right on the road and their route that even if they stopped at a certain point for everything to be unloaded, for say let's two barrels to be unloaded, once the 2 barrels were off, the horses gave the drayman and his companion kind of 30 seconds to get on board, and then they would just plod on, and they could be found at the next station, or at the end of the line, the pub, because they would have a natural stop, a natural halt at the pub that was the end of the shift. And so people knew where to find them. And there are quite a few little anecdotes about people with completely dray wagons and dray carts with no attendant, but the horses just going round, and people knew the horses and there was no problem. I find that kind of thing extraordinary. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, and it is amazing. And of course, the link that I tried to make in the book is that it's that kind of efficiency that those animals were bringing that made the Industrial Revolution possible. So whereas we perhaps read that and see that as sort of an interesting quirk that they're able to do, that it was actually really, really crucial. And also once you. Sorry, I think I switched myself off. And then once you obviously get into elite horses, things get interesting again, and you have the aristocracy being very fond. So the first Earl Spencer, when his hunter horse was out on a fox hunt and died, the first Earl had this animal buried on the spot with his very expensive bridle and saddle as a mark of the respect. And you'll find lots of aristocratic men and women writing about the deaths of horses and how they feel bereft, as if it's a family member. And you get that sense with the Byrons as well, perhaps, that it's not just their interest in gambling and speed, it's also the horses as well.
Definitely, and like as Lucy says, the poet himself, huge animal lover. He had dogs in particular, Bosun, who he has the monument, the tomb now to still at Newstead Abbey, which is just a lovely thing. But as well, his ancestors as well, the 5th Lord, obviously, huge racing enthusiast. And one thing actually I was going to add about that, I think there's not necessarily any remnants of his particular affection for the horses themselves as living creatures, but certainly as a status symbol and of sort of reflecting he's the country gentleman and here are his prize-winning racehorses, really comes across with him. And that was one of his absolute obsessions, when if there are any summers where he sort of falls from the historical record, you can always find him at the races, coming first or last or whatever, or riding himself as well. And one of the great things about him that I just loved, and I had to include it in the book, is that when he was in his early 20s, he was already well into this world, and he called one of his horses, "Why do you slight me?" And I just thought that was probably quite a nice little glimpse at his character, even in his early 20s. Why would you call your horse that? I don't know. Unless you're just being petty and ridiculous. But certainly horses, and he had as well. He bought a wolf puppy when he went on holiday after his he sort of gets off scot-free on his murder trial, promptly swans off on holiday and comes back with a wolf puppy as a sort of treat for himself, I don't know. But there are later accounts of this wolf when it's grown up being perfectly tame and running about with the cattle on the Newstead estate as well. So I just thought that was a lovely sort of combination between that sort of companionship and of the wolf, also probably the status of the wolf dog as well, but then it's just mingling with the herds of cattle on the estate as well.
Yeah, I also loved in your book as well. I mean, I have to say one of my favourite people in your book, Emily, is John, the Vice Admiral, who I sort of feel very sorry for. And I thought it was so interesting, the difference between him and his wife, who's so sociable, and he's so often choosing to go and ride his horse on his own, and that's something that comes up in my book, that 18th century historians have this obsession with sociability, and we often forget the other things that Georgian people loved doing, whether that was reading or gardening or going for walks or riding horses. And I thought that was a lovely contrast in your book between the kind of classic sociability and this sort of wounded survivor of a man who, I mean, I would just be fascinated to know what was going through his head when he was out riding his horse in those private moments. It's really interesting.
Well, I think he was terrified of his wife's friends for a start. He just didn't want to be around all the women. It was a bit weird for him, I think, but yeah.
It is really interesting, I think, whether it's aristocracy or whether people living in quite close confines with animals in the 18th century. This idea that we're coming back to really at the moment, and for some people it must be quite overwhelming to be told how they must connect with nature the entire time. But it's quite interesting for me. I think that one thing that spans both books and also the time period is probably that people were a lot more, and this keeps coming up in the questions quite a lot actually, sorry, just got another one, about just the engagement with the world. You were saying about social, and I agree completely, this obsession with 18th century sociability and politeness and things like that. Sometimes I think that people try and put a stencil onto something and form letters out of it that aren't really there, if that makes sense, or weren't there at the time. I think that in many ways lots of opportunities were opening up for people to be more sociable, and many of them took them, but also people were needing time to dial back from all of that. And I think particularly the Byrons are interesting because they were so involved in kind of just the natural world around them anyway. From their own point of view, it's very much put that they took part in as much as they wanted, whereas for Tom's ordinary people, they would be working in tandem with animals. And it was just, if either one of you wants to take us out of this, and obviously I think both of you and I will answer questions on Twitter after this if someone feels that they've not got in what they wanted to ask or anything else. But if one of you wants to take us out with how, now just give me 1 second to frame this. Do we feel that people in everyday life in the 18th century were interacting more with the natural world around them, even in a very urban setting, let's say, as the Byrons lived when they were in town, and the ordinary people in a city in Georgian England? Were they more in touch with nature or less than we are now?
Go for it, Tom.
I would say much more than now. I think I mean, one thing to link with Emily's book, and something that I think much more work should be done on, is the link between town and country, not least with the aristocracy and this relationship between their lives in their grand country estates and then coming down to townhouses. You know, from my point of view, I'm interested because they were moving horses between London stables and those estates. But you've also got the Smithfield trade brings the countryside into London, inevitably, including the knowledge. People often forget the amount of migration going on between the countryside and London and back again for work. And every time that happens,
a fifth of all people during their working career, you know, their working lifetimes, a fifth of all, we think, don't we, of the UK spent a significant amount of time in London, which is an astonishing number. Sorry, carry on.
I think people, rich, poor, and everything in between, were much more grounded in it. I mean, obviously, not many people are able to travel the world as much as the people in Emily's book. But I found some of those passages with John the Vice Admiral and his experiences on these parts of the world that hardly anyone else has ever seen. Really sort of breathtaking. His suffering in these far-flung places and his experiences of the world, really amazing. But also Isabella up in the Alps, sort of yearning to climb these mountains and the storms and everything you experience. I mean, one of the great things of your book, Emily, is your respect of the weather and landscape and geography, which are just so crucial to why your book is so lovely. And I think that just shows that, I mean, of course, we're exposed to lots of this stuff ourselves now, but I think even if you were very rich living in your thick-walled, lovely mansion, you still felt the full force of nature a bit more strongly than we do now. He says in the middle of a pandemic, but
yeah, no, I agree. I think it's probably something that's going to come round again at some point, and a proper, real sort of, I mean, it's all a bit airy-fairy, but from the sort of philosophical romantic movement point of view, obviously that's a real central tenet of romanticism, being appreciation of nature and the mountains. And, you know, the poet Byron says that very explicitly in his poetry. And as you mentioned, it comes through definitely in Isabella's personal correspondence that I sort of used to reconstruct her travels around Europe, and in John's as well, in his narratives of his travels. I couldn't include it all, but he just loved trees. He wouldn't shut up about trees and sort of landscapes and which parts of the world reminded him of which other parts of the world. So it was a wonderful read, and I had to sort of rein myself in a bit, I think, on describing that, because I don't think everybody cares. But yeah, I think it might come back.
Well, can't thank you enough, the pair of you, for being here today and allowing me to chair this lovely event, this armchair event.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. And yeah, again, two absolutely gorgeous books, people. So please do read them and enjoy them, particularly as we have a bit more time on our hands, perhaps, than we would have. So time to sit back and enjoy them all. Please do ask us any more questions through our Twitter handles, and I think we'll still be able to see more of your questions if you add them in here. And I think that this will be available to download again fairly soon. So no doubt we will put that out on social media and you'll be able to see that. But thank you very much to everyone who's listened today, and thank you to everyone who's involved.